topics of use and mention.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much all for coming, and thank you to Heidi especially for arranging this. I'm much obliged, and thanks for having me back for a third time. Hope I'm not abusing the privilege of being able to come back, because I'd like to come back again, because I love it here. And so this is, unlike Josh's, this is genuine work in progress. So I don't quite know what I'm talking about the whole way through. So I'd appreciate your questions and your help, because I'm still sort of working through some of this stuff. I've been working on stuff with counterfactuals, but I thought this might be more intuitive and more fun to talk about than dynamic semantics versus classical semantics on counterfactuals, which I talked about last time. And so, so that is all to say. Please, I welcome all your input and harsh questions, and I am looking for guidance for how to proceed. Let me start with an anecdote. We had a speaker at Davis a few years back who gave a talk to do with slurs and with the relationship of slur terms to torture. It was an interesting talk, and they kept mentioning slur term for people of Asian descent, which I won't say. And I have a colleague who asked about this in the question period. It was sort of a meta question about why it's okay to keep on mentioning that term. And the speaker said sort of what I would have said, I guess, a few years ago, which was, well, I'm mentioning it, not using it. And just for all of us so we're on the same page, the convention that, if you know this already, I apologize for insulting intelligence or background. But the idea was there's a way we have of using terms where you take a symbol to refer to something and you refer to that thing using the symbol. And then we have conventions for how to refer to the symbol itself. And these conventions are reflected in natural language, more or less imperfectly, usually with, in English at least, quotation marks. So the idea is if I say cats are bad, I hate cats, so my apologies. But cats are bad, that's a true sentence where I refer to cats using the term cat. Whereas if I say cats are bad, it's patently ungrammatical and basically says the word cats are bad. And so I'm hoping, like I said, this is all common coin, but this does little to do with cats, right? It has something to do with a term that refers to cats, but it itself is as disconnected from cats as you could get, right? So the thought then was, well, if you're trying to talk about slur terms and you're mentioning them rather than using them, then there shouldn't be a problem because you're not using a term in this sense to refer to denigrate a group. You're talking about a term that other people might use in order to denigrate a group, but you yourself aren't using that term, you're using a term that refers to that term, right? And so, long story short, that was the speaker's response. And I thought that seems reasonable, but then my colleague, who's also a very reasonable person, kept pushing and saying, no, it's not okay to use the sort of either the grapheme or the sound involved because it causes pain to listeners. And so I sort of thought, well, you might think that one side should have an error theory about the other side's opinions about this, because you might think, well, if you're mentioning not using, then you're just not using the relevant terms. But my colleague is an expert in use and mention. It's not like she doesn't know. It's not like she was unclear about this point. And she's a very reasonable person. So I started thinking, well, is there some sort of like middle way to be had here where we can make some sense of using and mentioning and the sort of ethical considerations involved? So that's my anecdote. One more thing I should have mentioned, I apologize. This is joint work with a colleague of mine named David Kopp. I know this is nothing about ethics whatsoever, so I have no right to put the word ethics in the title of any talk or paper that I publish or write. But because I'm working with someone who is an expert in ethics, I smuggled it in and he allowed me. So any things to do with ethics, I'm sort of copying from him. So if I can't answer it, I'll ask him and get back to you. So in other words, it's all his fault if I get things wrong. So the way I sort of came to this was thinking about slur terms, and there's a sort of puzzle about slur terms, which is that they obviously have this capacity to denigrate, and the capacity to denigrate groups that they're about, obviously is connected to the offense that they cause. And it's worthwhile distinguishing causing offense from denigrating. Because denigrating presumably is an action that you take to like put someone down or to display a group or someone in a negative or harsh light, whereas causing offense is entertaining or causing someone to be in a psychological state. And, it's very hard to give a theory of causing offense because the inputs to what can cause offense are massive. But when it comes to terms that are slur terms in particular, it'd be nice to be able to somehow connect these two, right? The evidence that you denigrate somebody or a group using a slur term seems to be something like that you cause offense. We want some way to block off cases where offense is caused accidentally, like if somebody mishears a term, for instance, and they take offense to it, but they misheard the term. So you want something like causing warranted offense. And want some way to presumably explain the sort of capacity of slur terms to offend by denigrating people where the evidence is something like people are warranted taking offense to utterances or assertions using slur terms in relevant contexts. So it's hard to get precise on exactly what property people interested in slurs are trying to capture or explain. This is my best attempt to sort of try to map out the terrain a bit. This is the sort of normative psychological state that people enter into, which is supposed to be somehow evidence for the semantic or pragmatic or social properties of denigrating. So the people I'm going to talk about sort of slide between these, and I'm going to slide between them a bit too. And where it becomes relevant, or if you think it's problematic, please stop me or please wait till the question period, but then ask me about it because I'd like to get as clear as I can about this as well. Okay, so there is this property that slur terms has that seems to be involved in causing warranted offense, which people want to explain in terms of denigrating properties of the relevant terms or phrases in question. And then the question is, all right, what's the best way to explain this? And every kind of philosophy of languagey explanatory category that you can think of or read about has been thrown at slur terms to try to explain the sort of properties that they have. So people have thought everything from, well, take a slur term S, and I'll just use S as my stand-in slur term. I'm sure we all are familiar enough with enough slur terms to substitute for S. I'm making an assumption here that they all kind of operate in the same way, which I think is a pretty dicey one. I'm hoping there's at least core notion that we can pick on. So at the extreme, a friend of mine, Chris Hahn, and a colleague of mine, Robert May, tried to defend the idea that, well, they cause warranted offense because they have denigrating meanings, right? And how to specify the meaning of a slur term to display why it's denigrating is kind of difficult. So I can refer you to the papers, but it's something like there's a group G that has warranted treatment. Sorry, my handwriting is terrible. T in virtue of being G prime, roughly. So it's something like a slur term is denigrating because it refers or has a meaning to pick out a group that has certain properties of how they should be treated, which is a bad way to treat them, all because they have some property G star. So you think bad words for Jewish people are because there's a group of people, Jewish people, who should be treated badly because they have the property of, and then whatever you think, the bad properties of, the supposed bad properties of Jewish people are supposed to warrant this treatment. That's the sort of sample meaning that you might give. And on the other sort of extreme end of things is one that doesn't take the meaning of the terms to be responsible for the denigration and the causing of warranted offense, but these are all friends of mine who I'm trying to pick on. So this is my thesis advisor, Ernie Lepore, and his student, Lovell Anderson, had this view called prohibitionism. And their idea was, the reason that you get this property related to this is because slur terms are on a list of terms that you shouldn't ever utter, whether you're using or mentioning. You shouldn't make the sound or write the grapheme of it. Why it's prohibited, each one will presumably have its own story. Who has the authority to prohibit it will be a separate question about authority. But the basic idea is that slur terms have this property of causing offense via denigration because they're on a list of prohibited terms, and you can't use things that are on prohibited terms. And then everything within the middle has been explored as well. But I'm going to look at these two extremes because each side has a kind of argument that's supposed to rule out the other side. And I'm going to try to figure out a kind of middle way between the two and then get back to explaining my colleague's frustration with the talk that I started the talk off with. Sound good? Oh, thanks. People rarely so unanimously say yes when I ask that. So I appreciate it. All right, so let's start with prohibitionism because this is my thesis advisor, Ernie Lepore and Lovell Anderson. And here's a kind of argument I'll try to expand on a bit as we go. So premise one, if a slur's derogatory meaning explains the offensiveness of uttering a slur term, then the offense won't be present in quoted context, but the offense is caused even in quoted context. And so a slur's meaning doesn't explain the offensiveness of uttering a slur term. So what does that all mean? Well, let's take the evidence. Take slurs in quotational context, and what they point out is when you take the time to quote a slur term, like if you say, take whatever stand-in for S you like has X letters, that's clearly a case of quoting or mentioning rather than using, right? Because you're giving a property, having so many letters is a property of the term, not of the term being referred to as referent, right? But of the term being referred to. And yet, it looks like you get this, even in those sort of cases, which is exactly what happened in the case of the talk at my school with my colleague. And so the best explanation there isn't by way of the meaning of slur terms, it's going to be by way of their form, not by way of their meaning. So if you think of slur terms as having a form, what's prohibited in effect is the form, and that's what explains this. And the evidence then is, well, we're all good at use and mention, and we're all still subject to the warranted offense caused by mentioning. And this is controversial, I should say, so we can fight about this, but this is my reporting what they say. And so since we're still having warranted offense caused by this, it has to be because of the form rather than the meaning of this, because the meaning of this is just a term, not the referent of the term being referred to. And as evidence for that, my colleague's a super reasonable person who has full understanding of the use-mention distinction, still felt what looked like offense, and if we're giving people the sort of charity of like thinking that when they're in clear cases that they still get offense caused, then it looks like there's a reason to think there's warranted offense, which gives you some reason to explain the denigrating properties of slurs by a prohibition on them. So I put a quote in to sort of sum up their view in their words. How is a content-based strategist going to explain how slurs inside these attributions, like these ones, ever have the power to offend if their content properties in such contexts are inert? So what does it mean to say they're inert? Well, it means to say that the referent of cats is not what's at issue with the term, quote, cats, just the word cats is. So the little furry demons that you pet and call cats are not at issue, and cats has 4 letters, okay? All right, so that looks on first blush, if you buy the premise that quoted context still cause warranted offense, looks like a kind of knockdown argument, right? Because all the rest of the architecture is already something we accept, namely how use and mention works, what the person putting forth is doing when they put forth a case of use and mention. And so you might think, all right, so much for competitors. But the competitors have an argument too, of course, so I wanted to look at theirs. And this is the view on the sort of other extreme that explains the warranted offense-causing properties by the denigrating properties being semantic or being part of the conventional meaning of the term, aka this, meaning this schema here. And that's known as combinatorial externalism. It's not the best name I think my friend could have chose, but what can I tell you? And they have an argument too that's supposed to cast suspicion on prohibitionism, the view that the problem with these terms is that they're on a prohibited list and they've been put there by people who have the authority and the right to put them there. So here's the rough argument from them. And again, I'm not sure they would put this argument in such a stark way, but we only have 45 minutes in the short life, so I've tried to distill it down to its essentials. If a slur phrase P can be present in a sentence without derogation, then the derogatory force of P can't be merely due to its form. P can be present in sentences without derogation, so the derogatory force of P isn't merely due to P's form. I take it that argument is clearly valid. It's a case of modus ponens with no suspect features or epistemic operators or something that would make, has been claimed to make modus ponens suspect. And the idea there is, well, if I can find you cases where the graphemic or the sound is present, but the relevant offense or justified offense isn't caused, then it can't be just due to the form, because the whole point of this is to say it's that form that's prohibited. And so wherever you see that form, you should think that the relevant denigrating properties are present. So what's the evidence? Hom has many papers on this where he gives you lots of these sentences, but I, again, chose one for the sake of time. And it's institutions that treat Chinese people as, and there's a slur term I could have put out in stars. I'm not sure how worldwide this term is, but it doesn't matter. Trust me, that's a not nice term for people from China, are racist. And so his thought goes, well, that looks like true, and moreover, it uses, not just mentions the relevant term, which is supposed to be prohibited, and it's non-derogatory. And so this is the sum up from Hom, the quote below the evidence. For example, in a discussion about racism, someone might utter, an institution that treats Chinese people as S are racist, which seems to be true, meaningful, and felicitous. The epithet in non-derogatory, non-assertive context carries this racist content while falling short of derogating its target because that is the very point of its use. So the thought goes, well, if this was right, then every occurrence in which you see a slur term should have the relevant properties. So they're like, you see it in like these weird contexts, like quotational ones, so it must be due to form. And then the counter is, but sometimes you see it in non-quotational contexts, so it can't be due just to its form. And so you can sort of see how each looks like they have a kind of toehold on the other, right? It looks like the combinatorial externalist has a case that prohibitionism, at least as stated, can't be right in full generality. And the prohibitionists have a case to be said that the relevant properties we're trying to explain can't be explained by the combinatorial externalist, the one who endorses this sort of view, because they can't explain all the contexts in which you get what looks like the exact same offense caused. So you might think a kind of dilemma here. You have two, I think, compelling arguments, both valid with seemingly true premises, but the premises seem to directly, or the conclusions seem to contradict each other, right? It can't be both only due to form and also not only due to form. That, you don't need a fancy logic to get you that that's contradictory and can't both be true. Now, of course, there's lots of moves for each side to make here, and lots of premises for each side to deny of the other one. There's a more tailored prohibitionist view, for instance, that might say, well, the prohibition isn't on like every instance or grapheme of the relevant term, and then try to specify which contexts are ones in which it's prohibited and which ones it isn't. And then the other side can point to them and be like, that's a highly unprincipled way to go about this unless you have a principled way to do it. No one's really produced a principled way to do it. So if you're looking for research projects, that's a research project that is a not bad one to take up. But it's not one that I'm going to take up. What I was thinking about was, well, both kind of seem wrong to me. And so I wanted to try to get a view that would generalize away from the particular issues involving slurs, look at other cases in which you might think you get similar properties for mentioned, not used language, see if we can learn anything about those cases, and then sort of return to the case of slurs and see if we can apply some lessons from there to the case of slurs. So that's all to sort of set up why I hope the rest of this is of interest and what we'll get back to at the end of the talk. How much time do I have? Where do we start? Sorry. Yeah.
You don't mention one single slur. In English is that you start with, you assume prohibitionism.
Well, I don't know it's false. It's just in case. I don't know. At one point, I kind of bought the error theory. Now I'm kind of nervous about it. So, and I'm not a good Canadian guy, and we don't like offending people. So, do my best to keep things neutral.
We only learn about slurs, it talks about the slurs. So either everything you prohibit talks about the slurs,
right.
Or if you give a talk about the slurs, we need examples to try to get intuitions about, and comparing similar things in our language, which probably are not exactly the same.
Yeah.
You can translate probably slurs very easily, or I don't know.
So two things. One, I'm not endorsing a general prohibition, but more nervousness on my half. And two, I'll get back to that point actually, because I think there's merit to it, and I'll try to address something that comes close to it.
If I remember well, Anderson and Lepore, we say that, or at least Lepore, it say that in a pedagogical context, you can mention slurs.
Yeah.
Like in your case here, you could put whatever slur without in a pedagogical context.
Yeah, I want to get back to that as well. So that, in effect, is trying to find a principled way to respond to anywhere it appears it should be bad, but I agree. Okay, so thinking about this led me back to a paper I read like early in grad school. I remember reading and being like surprised that I saw in it what I saw, and at the time like thought it was highly offensive. So sorry for the example, but this comes from Gareth Evans. It's example 2. I don't like saying all that much either, but so a man who beats his wife has more sense than one who gives in to her. Not anything I would assert or endorse at all. The opposite. Well, I'm not sure what the opposite is, but the presuppositions are obviously terrible. And I was sort of surprised to see this in a published paper, let alone like. And then I sort of like went through the same dialectic in my head that my colleague had gone through with the speaker. It's like, well, wait, this is a sentence being mentioned, not used. It wasn't being asserted. Its job is, it appears in the paper on E-type anaphora, and the idea is to show that you can have anaphora that don't look like they're bound as far as syntactic theory goes, but get interpreted as though they're bound by a higher quantifier. So in effect, her in this case, and one look like they're not under this relevant scope and yet act as bound variables. I take it it's a riff on Geach's old example, which was every farmer who owns a donkey beats it. And the Geach example, also kind of mean to donkeys, but less like inflammatory, obviously, than this, was supposed to show that you have every farmer, that's the person doing the beating of the donkeys, but you have a quantifier, a donkey, and yet the intuition is something like the farmer doesn't just beat one of his donkeys, but beats all his donkeys, or it's not true. And so the question was how do you get a donkey both to bind it and to act like a universal quantifier? And that became like a real puzzle in syntax. Gareth Evans' example is obviously awful. And the sign that's awful is like no one, his paper gets cited all the time because it's super influential. No one used that example or mentions that example. They all changed it immediately to less offensive but still offensive ones involving people and paychecks and partners. So still bad, but clearly an improvement. So then the question is, all right, so I take it we're on the same page about 2 not being an appropriate and offense-causing example to use in a paper. If you're not, that's fine. I'd like to hear from you. But if you are, it looks like it has similar properties to the case of the slur terms, right? Because we're all understanders of use and mention here. We went through it at the beginning. And this is clearly a case in which an example is not being asserted, but being displayed in order to give a case of a phenomenon, a semantic and syntactic phenomenon that has to be explained. And it's a good example of that, if not a good example as far as being something that you should put forth as an example of it. So it meets the relevant criteria for showing the phenomenon, but has moral properties that don't seem to make it one that you shouldn't be using. So then, if I'm right, and like I was getting warranted offense caused, and if you are as well, then that stands in need of explanation, right? Because, and the natural thing is like, so I'm looking through explanations A through F here. Natural question is like to say, okay, it's just an error theory. And maybe that's the right idea, that like we're all just in error about taking offense to this. But I take it that's like a last resort. Like maybe that's the right thing to say, but we should try out the other options first because we're all reasonable people and we all have the relevant mechanisms in mind. And so for the same reasons that if you think that people taking offense to slur terms in quotational contexts were not off the mark and taking warranted offense to it, I don't think by parity of reasoning we should be suspicious of ourselves if we take offense to this. So if you didn't take offense to the first case, then I think you're perfectly consistent on this. But if you did, and you don't hear, then I'd be curious to know why. I think they seem to stand in parity to one another. So I think an error theory is not a promising way to go about this. That we're all just somehow in error about what's warranted in causing offense and what isn't, when we seem to know all the relevant facts of the situation. It's not like we're missing something, right? I take it. If we are, then I'd be curious to hear in the Q&A what I'm missing in this case. Having said that, I want to get back to it because I think there's something kind of right about the error theory, and we'll get back to what that is. So we could try sort of all the categories of getting things across without sort of saying them that we have at our disposal. So you might think, well, in choosing that example, you might think that Evans is implicating something because it's an odd example to pick. It's highly aggressive, misogynistic, and at least indirectly, without directly, involves domestic abuse, which is awful. And so you might think there's a kind of hint of something terrible, and the hint itself looks like whatever you want to specify it as is highly offensive. So that should cause warranted offense. And maybe what we're offended by is a sort of implicature or hint caused by using an example like this. And maybe you can get a sort of common explanation here as well. I think that probably won't generalize very well, because in order to get that sort of hinting or implicature story off the ground, you have to do some sort of either thoughts about like mind reading what Evans was up to, or if you like the sort of relevance take on hinting and implicature, you have to sort of optimize for relevance, and it just doesn't look like you're optimizing for relevance by trying to figure out that Evans secretly was trying to get people to endorse domestic abuse. The most likely explanation for this came about was a kind of riff on the Geach case, right, of donkeys and farmers. Obviously, it's not okay to do this, but it's not like I think one's okay if I find out that Evans just made a mistake, right? So the offensiveness of one isn't just due to me having a theory of what Evans' mental state is like and what Evans was trying to get across, or what that example is optimized as far as relevance goes. Or if you found out, for instance, that like it was generated sort of randomly, and that Evans just decided not to take it out because he was lazy, then clearly it's not like he's hinting something, but the relevant offensiveness of the sentence stands, right? The relevant presentation of it in a paper is still there. And so any story that seems to require something like mind reading or like some sort of like figuring out what the sort of hidden message was behind it looks like it's not going to generalize very well. It doesn't even seem to like to explain this case very well. So I'd be glad again to hear a sort of more articulated version of this, but I don't think it's a promising way to start. Then one of my colleagues suggested maybe it's like a bad analogy. So I had a couple cases to try to get you in the swing of how this might go. Sorry, I should have had these ready. These are all coming from very like wildly off the charts American politicians. But here's Marjorie Taylor Greene, who if you haven't heard of, that's great. Don't look her up because it's not edifying at all. But her example involving wearing masks was, we can look back at a time in history where people were told to wear a gold star, and they were definitely treated like second-class citizens, so much so they were put in trains and taken to gas chambers in Nazi Germany. And this is exactly the type of abuse that Nancy Pelosi is talking about, where Nancy Pelosi was, in effect, urging mask mandates during the height of the pandemic, I guess about a year and a half ago. And so, it's not like Marjorie Taylor Greene was endorsing wearing gold stars or treating people as second-class citizens, just the opposite. But there's something highly offensive about the analogy that you get, right? That like the properties of like, a kind of general, fairly mild health proposal was being compared to the slaughter of innocents of millions of people. So you can sort of see like why people would take warranted offense to that. So maybe there's something around bad analogies like this, or analogies that are callous in terms of their comparison, because you're willing to sort of take something and use it as the comparison group to something that morally is not equivalent to it at all, you manage to implicate something that should cause warranted offense. And you do, but I think that's also not going to explain the Evans case very well, because the heart of the bad analogy story is the relational aspect of it, right? It's the taking of one thing and comparing to another, where the relevant level of equivalence seems absurd, and to be callously using one case in an unfair comparison to another. Whereas it looks like Evans' case doesn't involve anything like that, right? It's not like there's an analogy being put forth by Evans. So the relevant relational aspect seems to be missing. And so I don't think that gets to explain the Evans thing, but I think there's also something to the story as well. So for each one of these stories I'm rejecting, I think there's kind of something to them that I hope to put together into a package at the end. Okay, so what else might help explain the cases of taking warranted offense in the cases of quoted contexts, of cases of mention and not use? Well, one thing you might think is, let's think about another aspect of the talk that I began with, that I referred to. In order to talk about torture, one of the things that the speaker did was show some photos of torture from Abu Ghraib, and they weren't endorsing like the actions being depicted in the photos, and they definitely, quite the opposite. But they were putting it forth as sort of a way to jog your instincts about torture and to get what they wanted to put forth as an analogy between torture and the use of slur terms. However you feel about that, you have to go see the talk, because it was much more elaborate than I'm obviously giving it credit for. And the interesting thing about photos, right, is that the content's kind of transparent. So even if you're mentioning rather than using a photo, once you put the photo forth, the content's sort of on display, right? And so you might think, if you said, give me an example of a photo while you're eating and I showed you a picture of dog poop, right? Well, I'm just putting it forth as an example, but the relevant properties of dog poop are going to be there and, ruin your lunch or whatever if you don't have a dog. And so for me, it wouldn't matter at all. Maybe not for Heidi, because too used to it. But so you might think, well, that is a case in which you sort of see right through use and mention, because the mentioning brings along all the relevant representational properties that use does. And that seems also to me to be on the right track, except it can't really explain the Evans case, because the relevant terms are like one step away from what they represent, because they're being mentioned, not used. So the terms in 2, right, when I say a man, that isn't talking about men, right? That's talking about the phrase, or the sentence involving a man and the phrase a man, not men. And so it's not like 2 brings along with its representational properties in the way that a photo of something does, even if that photo is being used as an example as opposed to, say, being put forth as an answer, right? So if I say, show me something terrible, and I put forth something, I'm referring by the photo to the activity in the photo, presumably. If I say, give me an example of an answer to that question, I put it, right? That's my mentioning the photo, but the representational properties aren't going to be any different to the viewer. But that's not the case in language. So what might help bridge this? Well, here, if any of you know the cognitive science literature better and can direct me through it, I'd like to know this better. But there's a fact, I take it, that it's really difficult not to interpret things that you hear in your own language. That's why it's so annoying to have someone talk outside your window on a cell phone in a language that you understand, because you can't not interpret it. So when I tried to look at what the cognitive science contours of this were, I couldn't find a name for it. I found lots of people trying to figure out exactly how much voluntary control you had over this. And it turns out, if you're really good at focusing on something else, you can avoid interpreting things you hear in your own language, but it's extremely difficult, right? And so I was thinking that might help bridge the gap that the photo case has that the linguistic case doesn't, that when you hear 2, even if you know that's being quoted, you can't help but interpret the non-quoted thing, right? And interpreting is one step towards entertaining thought. And there's a fair bit of evidence that we entertain thoughts that we're told even when they're not put in assertive modes. And so I thought that might help bridge the gap. But the problem with 2 is that you're forced to entertain a thought, even though you know that the thing being put forth doesn't express that thought directly, because it's being mentioned, not used. And so I thought that seems kind of promising, because that plays the role, in effect, I'm thinking of being shown a photo, right? It has the representational properties built into it, no matter how you're putting it forth, under what sort of assertive or questioning or mentioning conditions there are. Okay, so you might think, all right, it's not okay to put forth something like 2 because it forces people to interpret who speak the relevant language, who are presumably the readers of the paper, who then have to entertain a thought that itself is highly offensive. And given that you're Evans, you know that that's the case, because it's not like I'm telling a story that's completely blowing your mind cognitive science-wise. It's like, I found this thing out that nobody knew before. If you hear a sentence in your own language, you're kind of stuck interpreting it. I'm relying on you already to have that as a familiar case. And so you might think, all right, so the ethical considerations then are 2's bad because you shouldn't ever say things in a mentioning way that's going to cause people to entertain thoughts that in effect are unpleasant in the relevant sense. But that can't be quite right, because there's obviously cases, this is getting back to the sort of Lepore and Capellan point and to Kepler's point, where you're justified in saying or using sentences that, and mentioning them, not using them, that like have the relevant properties that we've been talking about. So for instance, if somebody said, for whatever reason you want to make up that's really vital, I need to know exactly what Evans's example was in the paper that he wrote in 1977 about pronouns that he called a paradigm example. If the stakes on the line are like high, then you should presumably produce 2. And so that's why I feel okay producing 2 here. Because, sorry, I skipped from E to F, but because in effect there's a worthwhile goal that makes it okay to use or to mention the relevant thing that causes offense. And so you might think the relevant sort of seesaw here is between something like, what's the worthiness of the goal? Is it an okay goal? And what's the sort of offense or harm going to be caused by mentioning the sentence? And some trade-off between the two. But that also doesn't seem quite right, because presumably what's weird about Evans's case is the goal is a good one. Like, you really do want to figure out how E-type and F work, and they are of like substantial interest in linguistics, both in syntax and semantics. What's weird about, or what's bad about using 2 as an example isn't that there's something wrong with the goal, because that might justify the forced interpretation. It's something like Evans had so many other choices, right? The alternative basis for Evans was massive. And the proof in the pudding is that whenever people would talk about Evans's paper afterwards, they would never use this case. They would use other cases that exhibited the exact same semantic and syntactic properties. And so what led me to think then is the ethical considerations, or at least an ethical consideration about mention, is something like, in the event that your audience or assumed audience is going to be under forced interpretation situation, so if they speak the same language as you in particular, given that your goal is a worthy one to pursue, and given that there's like a kind of, what's the right word for it? Like it's worthy enough to outweigh the badness of forced interpretation of the thing that you're putting forth, and given that it does as well or better than the relevant alternatives, then you might think that you get to the point where it makes sense to think that mentioning things that are unpleasant is okay. And this brings you back, I take it, to the sort of slur terms. So if this view is right, then I have an explanation, I think, of what's going on in the 2 arguments. In the prohibitionism case, it looks like P1 is false because of the sort of forced interpretation character of this, but the relevant contexts in which it's not going to be cause offense will be ones in which the relevant goal seems worthy, in which the alternatives aren't present in order to like achieve the same goal in the same efficacious way. So this getting back to Eros' point from Capel and Lepore, educational ones are exactly the cases where if you want to tell somebody what term not to use and what its properties are, you're in rough shape if you can't mention that term, right? And to get to Kepler's point, the same, right? An audience that wants or has a goal that's a worthy one of understanding or knowing what relevant terms are to theorize about is one where it looks like you have a moral trade-off for the unpleasantness of the relevant features of the term. So maybe I made a mistake, in other words, because you in effect were telling me that there's a goal that I'm ignoring that's a worthy one, which might make it the case that mentioning terms that otherwise would cause offense is justified, because there isn't a better way to do it, right? Because without it, you won't subtend the goal of being able to focus on the same set of terms. So that's to get back to your point, which I appreciate, and sorry if I didn't do it justice. And so I think that doesn't show that prohibitionism is false so much as I think it undermines one of the arguments for it. What about combinatorial externalism? Well, the worry about combinatorial externalism is that if I'm right about this, you predict that there'll be cases in which in which using slur terms won't be okay, insofar as the sort of moral features that I'm trying to push about mention extend to use as well. So in the case of an educational context, in effect, if there's no term that you can use that will get across, or no term will do better, for one, being used in a pedagogical context to tell you, in effect, what institutions to ignore, if you can't find a better way to do it than one, then you think one has its sort of derogatory features overridden, or its moral features overridden by the necessity, in effect, of the pedagogical context. So you predict, in other words, that Cases of mention will be one where it's okay to do it, and cases of use will be one where it's okay too, insofar as the relevant alternative base for getting across the point lacks any better alternatives than what's on offer. So that's to say, neither that combinatorial externalism or prohibitions are wrong, so much as two arguments are supposed to knock down the other side, don't look like they're sound, even though they're clearly valid. Well, I guess with that, I'll call it a day. So thank you very much. Should I feel it?
About goals.
Yeah.
I'm quite convinced, and I like your talk.
Oh, thanks.
How would you analyze the famous John Lennon, woman are the, sorry for me to use that, woman are the nigger of the war?
Yeah, so.
It cannot accuse John Lennon to use the N-word to denigrate it. Is it used in a metaphorical way or what?
So, I mean, it's hard for me to know what John Lennon exactly had in mind, obviously. I guess if my framework's kind of right, I should say, by the way, one quick caveat. The framework does not predict that we'll be clear about how to apply the framework. So I don't have a theory of like what makes a goal worthwhile, for instance, at hand. And I don't have a good theory about like when something can constitute an alternative that's as good as something else, right? I take it in the case that you want to have a kind of impact, and that you know that due to forced interpretation, slur terms are going to have the relevant impact, that if the goal is to make the comparison, and there's no other way to do it, and it's a worthwhile thing to do, which I take it John Lennon thought, and our ambivalence towards thinking that he was like doing something terrible reflects, it's something like, he didn't have like another way to do it that was equally effective, that the point he was making was extremely worthwhile, and so, well, normally, if he just walked around saying that casually, you'd be kind of suspicious of what he was up to. The relevant context and pedagogical or moral aims of it overrode the relevant features that otherwise would make it prohibited. So if you walked around saying that, I'd sort of wonder about you. Or be like, here's my favorite John Lennon quote and said over and over and over again. I'd start to wonder what you're up to and why you're doing it. Whereas with John Lennon, I don't, because I figure.
Sometimes it seems to me, and this is from a personal experience, when in my language, or when I was learning Spanish, we used the word negro. And the professor said, why do you characterize him in Spanish as a negro? Just because it sounds just like the N-word in America, and negro is just mean black.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's just the sounds what can trigger some.
Yeah, I agree. And there's a bunch of cases that I'm familiar with in the United States, but I'm sure have happened elsewhere, where this sort of ambiguity has, or phonetic ambiguity has come up. There's a case of a guy who used the phrase, this is years ago, niggardly, which is has no like etymological root, but like, was not taken well. Yeah. And there's been a bunch of cases like this. There's a person who's trying to indicate a way of stalling in Chinese that involves like repetition of something that ends up sounding very much like an offensive term. I take it like that's what I was trying to like rule out by warranted offense. That offense can be caused by anything, and mishearing something or misunderstanding something can be a case in which you take offense. And so if your goal is to give a theory of like what causes offense, then that's a different game altogether. I got nothing about like, lots of people don't take offense, and maybe they'd be warranted in taking it too, right? I'm Jewish, but like pretty thick-skinned, and like I don't get super bothered if I hear like Jewish epithets. Maybe I should though, and I think if I did, I'd be perfectly warranted in doing it. But the goal isn't to like have a theory of like when you should be offended, so much as given that you have a range of terms, and I'm hoping to generalize it to like phrase their sentences that do have this relevant feature, what are their properties like? That doesn't tell you when you should think it has that relevant feature, of course. So I'm kind of assuming we have like a kind of core that we can use to explain, and then hard cases I don't know what to say about, because I don't know if you mishear a term that somebody's sort of callous about, if that is warranted offense or just causing of offense. So yeah, I wish I had better things to say. But the framework, I take it like, sorry, what I forgot to say in the talk briefly, sort of predicts like the kind of arguments that like the speaker and my colleague would have. Because the speaker, in effect was saying, look, I'm mentioning terms, and moreover, the goal of doing it is really important because I really want to like establish this connection that I think is morally important. And my colleague was disagreeing because they thought the value of the goal wasn't up to the value of, the disvalue of the relevant mentioning, and thought that there were alternatives. And so if you ask who's right about this, I think it's quite difficult to know because it's hard to know what the value of a goal is and what the value or what the relevant alternatives are going to be effective are in a context. So you're going to get, like I predict confusion all over the place as opposed to clarity, unfortunately.
You can also have cases, for instance, let's say I'm accusing Trump of being a racist, and I'm in a court or as a journalist, and they say Trump say that Obama is, and instead of saying that, it can say, so Trump said that, and they play Obama is an. In this kind of case, am I, as a reporter, I can be accused of being racist or offending?
I mean, unfortunately, the answer is going to be very from my framework base. But the question will be what's the relevant goal being subserved or presumed to being subserved by the recording and playing? If
I want to accuse someone of being a racist and I record him using, say, the N-word.
Yeah.
And in order to accuse him of being a racist, I somewhat have to use the N-word, and in some cases not to use the N-word, they can play the record.
I mean, if the relevant goal at hand is a worthwhile one of so if you're accusing Trump of being a racist and this is the best way to do it, then I think it seems like a reasonable thing to do. If you're playing as a joke for your friends, like recordings by Trump, then you might think the goal isn't the same, even though the action looks to be very similar, right? So it's very difficult, I think, to say anything useful about these cases without specification of what the presumed goal is. And then trying to find some sort of agreement over its value. But presumably, reporters, just like in a court case, if we're trying to establish someone's motive, and what exactly did they say? It'd be bad for you not to repeat what.
Pretty much, at least to some extent, against prohibition.
Against prohibition. Why? Oh, I see. Because.
Because you are. It's a typical case of mentioning in this kind of case.
Yeah. So, I take it the prohibitionists will start carving out exceptions, which is exactly what you said to me when I started, right? They carve an exception for pedagogical purposes. I take it the goal would be to carve out an exception in this case as well for reporting purposes. How principled that is, I think, is kind of difficult to judge. If the framework I'm trying to push is right, then you have a way of kind of figuring out what the prohibitionists should say. They basically should have more sensitivity to something like a prohibition relative to a goal via the alternatives you have to achieve it. At least that would be, I think, the best way to proceed. But
Thank you.
thank you. Thank you very much for all these questions. But this is, like I said, work in progress. I really don't know how to proceed. So.
Two questions. If not,
Sure.
Okay. So the first one is that I don't really get the difference between the hinting thing and option F, because if in a way, if you are using the term, and you know that this that the interpretation is forced, you are somehow putting it there. I don't know. Maybe I'm confused about this, or.
Yeah, sorry. So I was thinking the hinting case is the paradigm would be something like. Say you ask me a question, and not your question. Sorry, bad example. Say you're in my, say Josh is in my house. I want him to leave because I'm tired. And I say, here's a sentence, quote, leave my house, unquote. And I don't say anything more. That's a clear case in which I haven't asserted leave my house, but I've hinted that he should leave my house because the relevance of all of a sudden putting forth a sentence like leave my house out of nowhere is hard to make any sense of. Other than I'd like him to interpret it as an indirect assertion, right? So that's the kind of paradigm of hinting I had in mind, where you find clever ways to get the content of the sentence across, even though you haven't used the sentence. So yeah, maybe I hadn't been clear enough, but that's sort of what I had in mind. If you find a clever way to implicate the content of the sentence without saying it. But I take it that's like not what's going on in the case of forced interpretation. It's not like I'm endorsing the content so much as forcing you to entertain it. I take it that's different, right? Like I might want you to entertain and reject it, right? And be forcing on you in order to get you to reject it. But yeah, fair enough. I think I wasn't making that as clear as I could have in the.
And the second one
Yeah.
is that you always have alternatives, don't you? Like you can always say the N word, or you can say even if you with the purpose of imitating someone. Imagine that little children call the C word to one classmate. You can say, oh, you cannot say the word you have just said to this person. Or you can spell it, or you can, like,
Yeah.
always have alternatives.
Yeah, but so the question isn't if you have alternatives. The alternatives are as good at getting across the relevant goal. So for instance, if it's important for some reason that I know exactly what Heidi said, even if she said something terrible, sorry, stop using my friends for this. It's important I know what, like, John said, and like, it has to be reported exactly, then the relevant alternatives, for instance, for avoiding ambiguity or confusion they're alternatives, but they're not equally efficacious at achieving the goal. And if the goal is worthwhile, then the thought goes, even if you said something terrible, then you might think that overrides the prohibition on mentioning things that were, if the goal is to like find the most poetic way to explain the status of women that's gonna like have the most power, then N-word might not have the same effect. And if that's a worthy effect, we could fight about that because that's an aesthetic question, right? Not a linguistic question. Then you might think it'd be bad to use like a substitute for the term because it's not going to get across the relevant impact that using the term actually does. So it's not a question just if they're alternatives so much as what's the value of using an alternative towards promoting the relevant end given the relative worth of the end.
So then you have to balance between causing offense and the goal that you have.
Yeah, that's exactly, that's why I think a lot of these cases are very hard to judge because they're very difficult to give these sort of balancing acts. I think that's generally true, like when it comes to ethical considerations where the ethical consideration will involve something like a goal and a means, where you worry if the means are justified by the end, you're going to entangle yourself immediately in like thinking like how good is the end and how bad are the means. So if you have 3 variables instead of 2, it's going to be. So I don't have a way to navigate through algorithmically like how to determine these variables. But I think it is really difficult to figure out in individual cases like if someone's doing something wrong by doing it or if the goal is worthwhile. And you predict that if we don't have general agreement on the value of goals, that you'll get the sort of disputes that I saw my colleague have, right? And so, I walked away sort of thinking like they're both reasonable because they both have views that are reasonable about like how important it is to mention a term knowing its effects under forced interpretation given the goal they're trying to achieve. And my other colleague basically like, that's just not worth it, right? You should be much more careful in your calculus of like harm caused in order to like get to that goal. It's not as important as you're thinking to show photos, for instance, of torture in order to get the impact that you want. So, yeah, thank you. This is his second time hearing this, so it's not fair. He has a.
I think it's almost the same question I made the first time. I want to make sure. So I was wondering whether, according to your framework, there being no alternatives and the goals being worthy, whether they justify the mention or whether they cancel the offensiveness.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this since you asked it.
Because I think that there are actually two different projects. One would be to explain the offensiveness, and the other one would be to, give some sort of normative framework for when the goals might justify or might be worth even if there is some offensiveness.
Yeah, I appreciate when you asked it, and I'm still thinking about it. I'm not sure what the best thing to say is. I mean, officially, it's not about offensiveness, it's about the moral worth of doing an action. So I think officially, but I think it's hard to disentangle that exactly from, because the harm is like the offense, so it's hard to disentangle those as to, like they're separate projects, but they're clearly related in a way that I haven't figured out the fine points of yet, and I think you're right to ask. I should say, I do think it's sort of like there's, I think that what you're asking is an instance of a more general pattern, which I wish I had a better answer. Like, you know, if you have, I don't know, like you know, if you have something inside you that we need to do surgery on you to get out, but the conditions of surgery aren't gonna be all that good, so I have to like cut into you. I'm obviously causing you harm by cutting into you, but you think, okay, cut into me because this thing has to come out of me. And so you wonder like, well, does that mean I didn't harm you because overall I benefited you because you're gonna die from that thing in you, and I caused, you know, I in some sense caused you harm, but like action shouldn't be judged as harmful. Or, so is the harm canceled out, or is like the harm still there and that's bad to do, but the moral worth of, you see the parallel I'm trying to stress? I'm not sure what to say in that case, I'm also not too sure what to say here.
I guess it depends. I mean, I think the part of what makes this tricky is that the offensiveness depends on the audience. So you might have an audience that realizes that the goal is worthy and that there are no alternatives, and therefore this audience doesn't get offended.
Yeah.
Or it might be that the forced interpretation is still there, but they get offended, but they still recognize that it was the only way to do so. So I think that part of the problem is that offensiveness is kind of difficult to manipulate.
And it's worse than that in a way, because really what you want to get is a theory of, you know, warranted offense, not just offense. You know, like if you just have, like Evans presumably at the time had a audience of people he didn't expect to take offense to it, right? Like he wasn't thinking like, I'm going to offend my whole audience by this. You know, he expected his readership to not include people to be offended. And that was, you know, bad and like negligent, foreseeable problem. And so one of the things here, I guess, the question of like, who do you expect your audience to be versus who does your audience actually end up being? And I guess there's questions of responsibility there, like what should you do when you're not sure what your audience will be? And I think, well, that's the ethical situation we're all in. Like, you know, what do you do when you expect an action to have some effect, but you don't know like if it'll have that effect or like what the broad stroke of effects will be? So I just don't know what the right thing to say there is. I like to think like we can sort of focus on the case of two as opposed to like Evans's personality or something, like what should we think of Evans? The interest for me is like, what should you think of like cases of mentioning that seem to have the relevant properties people are worried about, as opposed to people who indulge themselves in mentioning of things that have the relevant properties. But yeah, to your original question, I'm just not sure. I take it like there's a general question to be asked, like I said, that I wish we had a better answer to, and I'm not sure in the specific case what the right thing to say is, but officially it's about moral worth of an action or disworth. Side note, I'd like to figure out like exactly what the difference is between causing versus canceling offenses, and if like, you know, there's a sort of dispositional notion in the background that's causing some of the trouble of telling. But yeah, thank you.
Sure.
So, thanks, it's super interesting.
Thanks.
And I don't know if this is a problem for your account or not, but I'll ask kind of how your account handles it to help me understand the account.
Yeah.
So it seems that the norms are sometimes different for slur usage, use or mention, if you're a member of the group that the slur is directed to.
Yeah.
So you can think of cases, and I know there's debate about this depending on the slur in the community and stuff, but you can just think of cases, it seems, where someone who's a member of a group towards which a slur is often directed is using the slur a bunch or mentioning the slur a bunch, causing the forced interpretation thing. But, you know, they might have lots of alternatives and their goals might be frivolous, but sometimes we're just okay with it for reasons that, yeah, I haven't thought anything about. I just wondered, this probably comes up in this literature.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess there's two questions that are hard to give answers to. Like one is, well, if we let people get away with it, that doesn't mean that it's not like warranted in causing offense, right? Just as we don't take advantage of the warrant that we have, right? You know, and like that can happen all the time, right? Like, you know, if I need to save Jewish kids in the building and I want to know what room they are, and like someone tells me that using a slur term, I might be like, well, I don't have time for this right now to, you know, get it back and forth with you about the ethics of slur terms. You know, there's kids to be saved, and I need. And so probably I'd be warranted under normal circumstances, blah, 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 but the relevant circumstances make me ignore it completely. But I think maybe the framework is just too permissive because I'm worried about this, but I take it if I was to try to force it into action to be something like, well, you do get these debates that I'm not super familiar with, but I know the contours of them, of like, well, is reclamation of a slur term a valuable like goal to be achieved that has, you know, using them, and it's hard to get an alternative to reclamation other than like reusing or using close variants of a term. Or is that goal like not worth using the master's tools, et cetera, you know, by taking the terms, and you see like this come out, like, you know, in conservative versus liberal like critics over use of terms under the state of reclamation, or, you know, what might be described as reclamation by a bunch of people's dispositions, even though they themselves aren't thinking of them as that. And so I guess the big second question is like, how do you think of like group dynamics as opposed to individuals? And there I really don't know what the right thing to say is. I think the framework could be expanded to both, but how the relations between the two go are going to be, I think it's super complicated. Does that help clarify?
Yeah, that's great. So super interesting to think that the goals part could be useful to when you think about the goals of reclamation, even if they're like implicit in a person's views. But that seems super promising. So then, just one other thought is whether, and this is just about how to flesh out the kind of picture too, because you're happy with this kind of denigration aspect of what's going on with slurs, since kind of everybody is.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you think it could be promising to think of not just the history of a term's use being a part of what makes it denigrating, but the history of who uses it as a part of the explanation for this kind of thing. So you know, like if a certain slur term is really coming from like one culture or one kind of position in some kind of social matrix, then people who are not as a part of that matrix, it might help explain like, well, they get a break because the reason it's denigrating was really because it was how it was being directed by a certain group onto that group, and not. So they get like special dispensation in a way that, you know, seems to call out for explanation.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting because like a lot of them come about what they call exonyms. Like one group calls another group something, and then it wasn't like wanted or like invited. I mean, the hard part about this is you want to get a framework, then you can actually do explanatory power work on particular instances. I think that question will come up immediately, like, and the varied histories and like varied events in the past and like who's around and who's been using them is a super complicated story that I wish I had more to say. But sadly, I think that's a job, well, maybe not sadly, a job for sociologists to be able to fill in the story. But I think once you have a story like that, then these stories can actually become much more like evaluable. Like, is it plausible that like the relevant group is offended or justified taking offense because of who's saying it, as opposed to like what semantic or what institutions around to give like that term meaning are? What are the relevant set of contexts in the historic in which they're used that like are related to now or unrelated to now? And I think, yeah, in any given case, there'll be a super interesting story that comes about. And people have been doing some of that work, but it's really complicated. I tried for like one or two just to trace the history of it, and you know, once you get back before like 1800, it becomes like really obscure, like how it's being used by who and why, and who was offended, or like thinking of it as an exonym versus. Yeah, thank you. I take away part of the explanation. I wish I had substantive things I could use in the explanation right now, but definitely a project for going forth.
I couldn't help thinking about Evans' example.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how he was. I never met him, of course, but I mean, maybe he had a point. But on the one hand, it seems that the beating wife thing example at the time was much used for presupposition, right?
Yeah.
When did you stop beating your wife in this kind of example? But
Yeah.
It was also at the time, I think, it was the time when they had this Chomsky versus the generative semanticists. And in fact, it seems that people accuse Chomsky of having very dull examples, like John is very easy to please, and John saw Mary with a telescope, and the other side was using examples in the dissertations, using sex, drugs, politics.
Yeah.
In fact, there were several linguists that couldn't defend their dissertations because they were prohibited. So you have this context, and this example by Evans comes after that. So it seems like, maybe he was making a point that he was a sexist or not. I thought he was just a comic. So I don't know. That's an aside comment.
Yeah.
It's interesting how you can have example. I mean, dissertations that were not passed or delayed several years for having these kind of examples about the wife of the CIA director and things like that.
Yeah. You think Chomsky is the most radical amongst them with the most boring examples.
Chomsky was the boring example type, but the other ones were crazy examples,
Yeah.
maybe offensive for some people.
Yeah.
I was just curious about where Evans fits here. Maybe that was a debate in war among American linguists and Evans.
Here's this British guy.
Yeah.
I sort of assumed it was from the Geach example, and like a kind of take on the Geach example. He doesn't explain. He just says, here's a paradigm case, and moves on. When I first read it, I was like, that's a paradigm? That's a terrible case. It's like, it illustrates the phenomenon, but what an awful thing to put in writing. To sort of like harp on a point from before, like every, I guess, view that's going to involve ethical evaluation, there's going to be a sort of actor-act distinction to worry about. And so, you might think, well, if I really knew about what he was up to at the time, what he was thinking, there'd be a story that made me think Evans was not doing something that seems pretty horrible. I guess it's always possible, right? It'd have to be a pretty good story because it's a pretty horrible example. I'm hoping though, even with that story, you can think of the act like the product, not the producer, the product, not the producer, and evaluate its properties as well. Whatever his intentions were, should this be the kind of thing that's in a journal? And I think it's difficult because often you're held subject to what the future will be like. In Evan's case, it's obviously pretty horrible what he's talking about. But you can see other examples where people trying to do something, reasonable, will be seen as something very unreasonable as time goes on. And so, the ethical future is always dark and unforgiving. But, yeah, thank you. I guess I just assumed the donkey story, but you're right, there's more context to it and other examples that are suspiciously similar to it to worry about. Oh.
So I was thinking about how the forced interpretation applies in the case of non-native speakers. And it happened a couple of years ago to me that I was speaking with a British friend, and at the time I wasn't aware that that mentioning slurs could be problematic as well. In particular, in this conversation, I mentioned the N-word, and this friend got upset. And later, I learned that it was also problematic to mention, not only to use, but to mention as well as certain slurs. So I was wondering whether the problem in this case was that my English skill was not good enough to trigger this forced interpretation, or whether I was simply not aware of a convention in the English-speaking community that I could not even mention the word. So I actually don't know whether it was one or the other.
Yeah. Well, it's about you, so you should tell me. But it's hard for me to know.
You might have to do as well with you need a deep understanding of the language to interpret. I'm not sure, because I knew at the time that I couldn't use it. So why didn't I trigger myself this forced interpretation that's...
Yeah. Oh,
So
sorry.
it's just because I was also thinking it can also have to do with, see, in both in the, I mean, if I always remember watching American TV or British TV when they bleep the fuck and they put bleep, and for us it's just I mean, it's just funny. Why do they do that? We all know what they're saying.
Yeah.
Why do they do the bleeping thing? Why don't you, it's ridiculous. And then you see it written down and they put the stars. For us, culturally, that's completely crazy. We don't have that. I mean, if you know, because it's the same listening to fuck bleep, to listen to fuck, it's just the same. So I think it also has to do with that. I mean, it's for like a, I don't know, in America, whatever, it's like, okay, if there's a bad word, don't even mention, we don't even want to hear it. And for us, it's like, come on, you can hear it. It doesn't mean you're insulting anyone, it's not. And I think it may be there's something cultural there too.
Yes, but I think that
Not only language,
we have
knowledge.
slurs as well that we are not very comfortable even mentioning, I think.
No, but
it's not, I mean, maybe it's not morally wrong, maybe it's...
But you could watch it on a movie.
I wouldn't be, I mean, maybe it's I've been influenced already by this.
But you can watch it on a movie. I mean, you can watch it on a movie and it's okay. You don't need to go bleep because we know that, you know, it's a movie, it's a context.
Best example is Gordon Ramsay.
I don't know.
He used the F word like a comma, and he's a cooker, he's a chef, and he's a cook. And when you see it in Canada, because he used the F word a lot, you hear beep, beep, beep,
Yeah,
beep.
yeah.
Yeah.
But that's so there was you wouldn't use in a normal like an insult I would have got, but you can watch it on the TV and it's not offensive for you if you're seeing a conversation between two people that one people insults the other. But if you go to American TV or whatever, they put the bleep, even though we all know what they're saying, but it's just we don't even want to hear it. And for us, it's not like so. Maybe it's, and what I wanted to say is it's not only lack of knowledge of the language, it's lack of knowledge of the conventions or the whatever, you know, the, I don't know how to call it,
Yeah.
the way to kind of, yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
I thought this was something really like American. Like, is it the same in British people also do this thing with the stars and this thing?
With the bleeping.
With the bleep?
I don't think so.
yeah.
It's not language, it's something.
American philosophers and Canadian.
But I mean, I thought it was also the case that, like, for us, for people whose second language English is, English swear words just don't sound as bad as swear words in your own language. So, you know, I find it easy to say, oh, fuck this. To me, it's just a word. I mean, obviously, I know it's, you know, a swear word,
Yeah.
but if I were to use something like the equivalent in Danish that I grew up with, it doesn't sound right to me. Like, it has a much bigger effect. So I think that there might be that effect too, you know?
Yeah. I mean,
Basque people are famous for swearing a lot.
Definitely.
Well, I was talking about
When talking in
Spanish.
Spanish, talking in Spanish,
no, I mean, there's definitely a cultural aspect to it. Like, you know, like Americans and to a lesser, but, you know, still large extent Canadians, like I mean, as far as I can understand, like trying to not get their kids to say terms. And so they thought if they don't hear them like regularly on television, they won't go around saying them. And obviously that's a grand failure, but like that was, I take it the idea. Whereas, you know, if British kids aren't trying to get their kids not to say that, then like they'll have way less of a prohibition on like mentioning or using terms that they like, you know, think shouldn't be in the general vernacular, especially for like younger like kids. Back to the original question. I'm not totally sure, but I take it like if we really sort of start to dig down into forced interpretation, that's, and this is to my shame because I haven't been able to investigate as much as I like, there's probably going to be more than just something like semantic value involved. So forced interpretation presumably is not going to be just what the term means, but something like what the associations with the term are like. Like, you know, what associations get triggered. And like, associations can be kind of happenstance, or they could be like fairly reliable. And so in a population that's like been really inured to like, this is a bad term that like is generally used to denigrate people, the associations might well be different than if you're aware that it's a bad term, but don't realize the kind of like painful associations that come with mentioning of it. If that's right, then it's totally understandable why you'd be like, well, I don't get it. Like, I'm not saying. There's a podcast I like that has this Australian guy and this American guy, and like they do like these history podcasts that I really like because they do these very detailed dives. But like the American guy is surprisingly reserved, and the Australian guy is just like swearing all the time. And then like they constantly come up against slur terms. Like the Australian guy's constantly like bewildered as like why the American guy like won't even mention them. He's like, well, it's not like you're calling someone this, but all the time for my white friends, I'll say, and like break out like this chain where I feel like mildly uncomfortable listening to it. And so you can see these kind of cultural dynamics like at work. To get back to Josh's point, like it may well be there's a history of slavery in one case that's more like in people's consciousness in the other case. I mean, there might be all sorts of explanations about why this comes about. And I think what your question is pointing to that I think is right on, which obviously needs more work, is what is the kind of like forced interpretation bring with it? Is it just like contemplation of a semantic value, or is something like contemplation of semantic value along with the sort of like general lexical features that might not be semantic, like its register features or its connection to like reliable association with other things that like find painful to think about. And so I don't know in your case in particular, but I think there's a range of options, and I wish I had better control at this point over how they associate and work. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so this was kind of about this a little bit, but it's kind of, this discussion has been evidence for a thought I had, so I thought I would see what you thought about it.
Yeah.
It's probably more problematic for the prohibitionist view, although I don't know that it's like problematic for you view. But the idea was, in some places, so I can't speak for many cultures outside of kind of where I grew up, but I know it's the case in America that there's a kind of history of people using the use mention distinction nefariously.
Yeah.
I'm just mentioning it, but they're clearly not. And I think it's also clearly the case that at least in kind of US culture, which this podcast is a good example of, British culture a little bit and Canadian too now, even just mentioning slur terms has now become much more offensive than it used to be. I just don't think that people were that up in arms, but lately it's become a much bigger deal. I think one explanation would be because we've gotten used to this also just being a way to imbue the slur term with meaning, even in the mention case, you just learn how to,
Yeah.
So now you're not sure if someone's doing that or not, so you're going to be a little bit triggered by it, which suggests that while this kind of argument from Anderson and Lepore works for some cases, that there are just cases where it looks like maybe
yeah, I mean, right. So in other words, even though you're perfectly adept at the use mention distinction, you're still gonna like see through.
Almost like the power of that distinction in this context has been canceled by the history of use or by the cultural background associated with it or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess part of the project like depends on whether or not like finding out what somebody's intentions were in doing it like has a kind of a direct effect on like the ethics of doing it. Because we like to separate up the two, and if it turns out like really it is like what is the person trying to do that matters, then I think this project is not on the right track at all, right? Because then I think probably something like B, like the hinting thing is what's at issue. Like try to get behind the person's head and see what they're doing, and that is what is like sort of end all and be all for. I don't think that's the right way to think of it. I mean, I think in some cases that might explain individual action, why we react to people, but I don't think that's the right general story. But I agree that if it is, I'm kind of in trouble with this. Fair enough. It's hard to be right in philosophy, so. But yeah, I think probably in like, because we're creative in like bad ways, there will definitely be cases in which the right explanation looks like we're offended because of what the person's up to. And that seems right. How to disentangle that for a general view, but like how to explain generally, I'm not sure what the prospects are at this point, but yeah, thank you.
If I may give you another example,
Sure.
Just a question. Just another example that I guess that maybe interesting for you because it exploits like I think different features that you were mentioning. This at the beginning of this year, I think a school in some place in the United States, I don't remember very well. The school board they decided to forbid Mouse, a comic book by Alex Spiegelman.
Oh yeah.
And one of the reasons was that characters in that book curse. So that, you know, kids that are like 14 or 15, or I don't know how old they were, but they were like this 14 or 15 years old for reading that book.
Yeah.
You know, that they could take the book and just by reading it, curse it. Course.
Yeah.
So that was an important reason for forbidding to read that book in school. I think first, I mean, maybe interesting, maybe understand sample for you because we have this use and mention distinction. I mean, the kid would be cursing by mentioning something that is written in the book. But, I mean, the thing is that on the one side you have that, but on the other, I find that very offensive. Because we are talking about a book that is about the Holocaust, a book that explains how some kids that were members of the family of the writer were assassinated, where you can see survivors killing each other because, you know, one is sick with, I mean, where they are going and whatever. I mean, it's a very hard book, and you have a book about the Holocaust like that, and telling someone that, you know, it should be forbidden because kids can curse by reading it.
Yeah, yeah.
That's offensive. Yeah. So, I mean, it's not that much here. That's, you know, an example that I think that exploits a couple of things.
Yeah. I mean, I appreciate it because I think if you want me to like force it into my framework, it'd be something like these people have crazy goals, like to like, you know, keep you from something pedagogically really valuable because their goal is to like avoid seeing swear words at like all costs. Yeah. That seems like off the charts crazy, right? And I agree. Yeah. Because you're like, how could that be like the hill you're dying on, as they say, as opposed to like knowledge about like this important event that like still has ramifications today, right? Yeah, I agree. I mean, I would think that would be explained by a disagreement over goals, and them having offensive goals. But like that's, you know, nothing about the framework prevents people from having bad goals, unfortunately. And this seems, I agree with you, like a fairly bad one. And, you know, for what it's worth, too, like, it's related, I take it, to, like, bleeping of, like, terms, right? The cultural sensitivities change in ways that are unpredictable and difficult. Like, as do the alternatives, for what it's worth, to get back to your question. Because I remember my colleague and I first started writing about this, we thought, well, if you're mentioning terms, like, you should, because you're talking about those terms, right? And one thing that did happen was the availability of alternatives. It's not like in the sort of abstract sense, but like the actual used real-life sense became much more widespread. So like the convention of using the N-word, for instance, in papers, like became much more widespread in a way that then was sort of common coin, in a way that you could stop using one term. So I think what might have been okay at one time, or maybe not okay, but like you made judgments about relative alternatives now are different because the actual lived experiences of alternatives are distinct. You know, it struck me for a while because, you know, like there's a lot of work done on this. Like people would always say the N-word, but then mention every other slur term. It's like one that was always haloed, and maybe you wonder, like, what is the sort of ethics of picking this? And I take it it's something to do with not just semantic value, but something like the associations with the term. And so, you know, I sadly look forward to a day where all the stuff I've written looks bad because the relevant alternatives are high, and everyone will wonder, why aren't they using them back then? It's a good question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.